Hello everyone, my name is Putri Alexandra Posner and I'll be presenting about trade policy analysis. The first one, there's absolute advantage revisited. In chapter 2, we developed a model of absolute advantage and applied it to trade in rice between Vietnam and Japan, where we assumed the demand conditions in the two countries to be exactly the same. Consequently, we can use the same demand curve in both the diagrams of this figure. We also assume that supply condition in the two countries that Vietnam's supply curve for rice is further to the right than Japan's supply curve. The autarky price of the rice in Vietnam, which is PV, is lower than the autarky price of rice in Japan, which is PG. This gives Vietnam an absolute advantage in producing rice. The world price is PW. It settles between the two autarky prices. Vietnam exports rice, whereas Japan imports rice. The world price will adjust to ensure that Vietnam's exports are the same as Japan's imports. Note that in moving from the autarky to trade in the figure, there is a reduction in domestic quantity supplied in Japan, as indicated by the downward arrow along SJ. It is possible that the firms producing rice in Japan will lobby the Japanese government to oppose this decrease in domestic quantity supplied, demanding protection from Vietnam's exports. Next, there is trade policy measures. When a country seeks to grant import protection to a sector of its economy, it can choose among a number of measures that can be broadly classified as either tariffs or non-tariff. A tariff is a tax on imports. There are two primary kinds of tariffs. A specific tariff is fixed tax per physical unit of the import, and an ad valorem tariff is a percentage tax applied to the value of the import. Next, there is non-tariff measures, or NTMs. There are four categories. First is tax-like measures, includes anti-dumping, or AD duties, countervailing duties, or CVDs, temporary import surcharges, and variable levies. Next is cost-increasing measures, include what is known both as standards and technical regulation, or STRs, and technical barriers to trade, or TBTs, sanitary and phytosanitary SPS requirements, prior import deposits, customs procedures, and reference or minimum import prices. Then there is quantitative measures, is a large group of NTMs including import quotas, tariff rate quotas, or TRQs, voluntary exports restraints, or VERs, import licensing, foreign exchange controls, sanctions and embargoes, local or domestic content requirements, and import or export balancing requirement. Lastly is government procurement. Practices concern the processes that governments employ in determining their contract procurements and the posture of these contracts towards imported goods. Next is the tariff. Let's introduce a specific tariff on Japan's imports of rice. This policy is depicted in this figure. The world price is PW. At this price, Japanese rice suppliers choose to supply QS, and Japanese consumers' demand is QD. The difference, QD minus QS, is ZJ, is imported from Vietnam. Suppose then that Japanese government imposes a specific tariff of T on its imports of rice from Vietnam. This raises the domestic price of the imported product above the world price to PW plus T. In the case of Japanese rice, the domestic price is many times larger than the world price. Japan's production of rice expands from QS to QS tariff. Domestic consumption of rice falls from QD to QD tariff. Imports fall from ZJ to ZJ tariff. The tariff has suppressed the importing relationship of Japan with Vietnam. In addition to the quantity effects of a tariff, there is also a set of welfare and revenue effects. This involves Japan's households, firms, and government. Next, there is terms of trade effects. The fall in the price of an import good is one kind of terms of trade effect. It is depicted in this figure. The main difference between this figure and the previous one is that in this figure, the world price does not stay constant as the Japanese government places a tariff on imports of rice. The world price before the tariff is PW. After the tariff, the world price falls to PW tariff, and the tariff is placed on top of this lower world price. Therefore, after the tariff is placed, the domestic price is PW tariff plus T. The net welfare effect in this figure is different than in the figure before. Next, there is a quota. In import, quota is quantitative restriction on imports and one important type of NTM. Suppose that instead of imposing a tariff as in the previous figure, Japan imposes a quota. We examine it in this figure. Before the quota, rice imports are ZJ equals QD minus QS. For political economy of trade reasons, the Japanese government is not satisfied with this outcome. It decides to restrict imports to a smaller amount, ZJ quota, equals QD quota minus QS quota. This policy induces a shortage of rice relative to the initial situation without the quota. The domestic price of rice in Japan rises from PW to P quota. The difference between these two prices is known as the quota premium. As the case of a tariff, consumer surplus falls by area A plus B plus C plus D, and producer surplus increases by area A. The new matter we must deal with in the case of a quota is in the nature of an area C. A quota policy is typically administered via a system of import licenses. In effect, the quota policy has restricted the supply of import licenses in the world. The area C represents the extra value of the right to import amount ZJ quota. It is known as quota rent. Who receives the rent depends on how the quota licenses are allocated. There are two common possibilities. The first one, import licenses are allocated to domestic, which is Japanese, importers. Here, the quota rents accrue to the importers, so they remain within the country. They are a gain to Japan. Second, there's import licenses are allocated to foreign, which is Vietnamese, exporters. Here, the quota rents accrue to these exporters, so they leave the country. They are a loss to Japan. In the case of import licenses allocated to domestic importers, the area C is a transfer from domestic consumers to domestic importers. Area C is a loss to consumers and a gain to importers for a net effect of 0 for Japan as a whole. Our net welfare effect is just like a specific tariff, equal to the quota premium P quota minus PW. That results in an import level of ZJ quota, known as the equivalent tariff. In the case of import licenses allocated to foreign exporters, area C is a transfer from domestic consumers to these foreign exporters. It is no longer a net loss of 0 because the loss to consumers is not offset by a gain to domestic importers. Our net welfare effect is simply the gain to firms less the loss to consumers. In this case, the quota is worse than a tariff that results in an import level of ZJ quota. Last, there is comparative advantage models. As we recall, the comparative advantage model analyzes more than one sector simultaneously. For example, rice and motorcycles. Given the importance of the comparative advantage perspective in many trade policy issues, trade policy analysts have turned to mathematical models of comparative advantages known as Applied General Equilibrium or AGE models. So that's it for my presentation today. Thank you.